The geopolitical architecture of the Middle East is undergoing a tectonic realignment as Washington deploys a deliberate strategy of kinetic encirclement targeting the Iranian regime. This strategic maneuver establishes a multi-domain containment perimeter, integrating advanced naval strike groups and air superiority assets to secure absolute dominance over the Persian Gulf. Beyond mere diplomatic posturing, the Pentagon is constructing a physical wall of fire designed to asphyxiate Tehran's strategic options through an overwhelming mass of firepower. The operational tempo is currently dictated by the transit velocity of the USS Gerald R. Ford, the most technologically advanced aircraft carrier ever built by man. While the Ford accelerates through the Mediterranean, the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group maintains its station, enforcing a lethal denial of area bubble across the region. This dual-carrier dynamic orchestrates a classic pincer move, allowing American commanders to project devastating force from both the Persian Gulf and the eastern Mediterranean simultaneously. Supplementing these massive naval assets, the United States Air Force has forward-deployed elite squadrons of F-15E Strike Eagles to hardened air bases throughout the regional theater. These platforms are supported by the rugged A-10 Warthog, creating a layered offensive capability optimized for both deep strike penetration and localized close air support missions. Critical to this rapid military buildup is the strategic deployment of terminal high-altitude area defense batteries to eastern Jordan, solidifying the regional ballistic shield. This defensive architecture is precision-engineered to neutralize the primary vector of Iranian retaliation, focusing specifically on their vast arsenal of medium-range ballistic missiles. The ultimate strategic objective is to strip the Iranian regime of its deterrence capacity, forcing a choice between total capitulation or swift regime decapitation. Diplomatic channels remain nominally open in Geneva under Swiss mediation, yet these high-stakes talks occur under the lengthening shadow of a unilateral American deadline. President Trump has established a narrow 4-week window for a diplomatic breakthrough, synchronizing the expiration of talks with the arrival of the Ford carrier. This synchronization reveals a bargaining under fire doctrine, where military escalation serves as the primary lever to extract permanent concessions regarding Iranian nuclear enrichment. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump have aligned on a strategy of maximum pressure, specifically targeting the economic lifeblood of Iranian crude oil exports. The economic warfare component focuses on severing the energy supply chain to China, which currently absorbs nearly 80% of Iran's illicit maritime oil output. By interdicting these critical maritime flows, the alliance aims to precipitate a liquidity crisis within Tehran, starving the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps of necessary operational funds. Internal stability within the IRGC is already compromised, as the regime faces a resurgence of civil unrest following the violent suppression of the January morning protests. Intelligence reports indicate the regime is deploying advanced digital surveillance and facial recognition dragnets to preemptively dismantle dissent networks before the next wave of instability. The intersection of external military pressure and internal socio-political fracturing creates a unique volatility window that the United States and Israel intend to exploit. Current wargaming scenarios definitively reject a ground invasion, as logistical models predict a protracted and resource-intensive attrition war with unacceptable casualty rates for allies. Instead, the emerging operational plan favors a high-intensity air campaign targeting command and control nodes, nuclear infrastructure, and the regime's ballistic missile depots. This decapitation strategy relies on precision-guided munitions to sever the leadership's ability to communicate with field commanders, effectively paralyzing the entire Iranian state apparatus. The target list prioritizes the physical liquidation of the IRGC hierarchy, neutralizing the ideological engine of the revolution without the requirement for a ground occupation. Iranian leadership, cognizant of this vulnerability, has engaged in furious rhetorical signaling, accusing European powers of total capitulation to Israeli influence during preliminary negotiations. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi's condemnation of the Geneva talks as a circus reflects Tehran's profound anxiety regarding the cohesion of the Western diplomatic front. Despite this public bluster, Iranian negotiators are engaging with Omani intermediaries, attempting to navigate a path that preserves regime survival without surrendering nuclear status. The core friction point remains Iran's refusal to halt uranium enrichment, a capability they view as their ultimate insurance policy against Western-led regime change efforts. Conversely, the American administration views zero enrichment as non-negotiable, asserting that any fissile material production constitutes an existential threat to broader regional stability. This diplomatic impasse is exacerbating the risk of miscalculation, as both sides interpret defensive maneuvers as direct preparations for an imminent offensive first strike. Israel's specific nightmare scenario involves a use-it-or-lose-it launch of Iran's ballistic missile inventory, aimed at overwhelming regional missile defense systems. To mitigate this threat, American Aegis-class destroyers stationed in the Persian Gulf provide a robust layer of missile defense capable of intercepting threats in the exo-atmosphere. The saturation of the battlespace with advanced sensor arrays and interceptors is designed to negate Iran's volume fire strategy, rendering their offensive tools operationally obsolete. In the Gaza sector, the conflict has shifted toward a stabilization phase, with the IDF preparing to transfer administrative control to a technocratic Palestinian government. However, the total disarmament of Hamas remains the critical prerequisite, a process scheduled to commence in March under the oversight of local Palestinian security forces. The Abu Shabaab militia, operating in the Rafah sector, has initiated independent clearing operations to neutralize Hamas tunnel networks and weapons caches near the border. This localized transfer of security responsibility represents a pilot program for the day after governance model, which strictly excludes Hamas from any future power structure. Yet, intelligence confirms Hamas operatives are infiltrating medical facilities like Nasser Hospital, using civilian shields to preserve their remaining military and command structures. These violations of the ceasefire protocol underscore the difficulty of eradicating an entrenched insurgency that consistently leverages civilian infrastructure for its own survival. Hamas is demanding the integration of its police apparatus into the new administration, a maneuver designed to retain de facto control under a cooperative veneer. The international community, led by the Peace Council, has rejected this demand, insisting on a complete decoupling of governance from Hamas's military and political wings. Meanwhile, in the northern arena, the Israeli Air Force is executing a relentless degradation campaign against Hezbollah's logistical backbone throughout southern Lebanon. Recent airstrikes have targeted weapons depots and launchers south of the Litani River, enforcing the demilitarization zone mandated by previous international ceasefire agreements. Hezbollah remains a potent threat, with vast stockpiles of heavy rockets concealed in civilian villages, evidenced by the discovery of 1,300 Grad rockets. The IDF's strategy is one of active defense, utilizing intelligence-driven raids to capture senior commanders and dismantle infrastructure before it can be utilized for attack. This includes daring cross-border extraction operations, such as the capture of a senior operative in Al-Araqi, demonstrating Israel's absolute freedom of action within Lebanese territory. The ultimate variable remains Iran's willingness to sacrifice its proxy network to save the regime core, or whether it will abandon its regional arms. As the USS Gerald R. Ford closes the distance, the window for diplomatic resolution narrows, compressing the timeline for decision-making in Tehran, Washington, and Jerusalem. The coming weeks will determine whether the Middle East enters a new era of containment or plunges into a conflict that will redraw the map. We are witnessing the final preparatory phase of a systemic collision, where the mechanics of war are being positioned to force a political outcome. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group serves as the primary vector of power projection, operating a lethal air wing of nearly 100 fixed-wing assets. Spearheading this force are the F-35C Lightning II stealth fighters, providing fifth-generation sensor fusion capabilities that penetrate contested airspace to designate targets for standoff strikes. Complementing the stealth component, F-A-18E, F-Super Hornets deliver heavy ordnance loads, sustaining the high-tempo sortie generation rates required for a prolonged saturation campaign. The imminent arrival of the USS Gerald R. Ford introduces the electromagnetic aircraft launch system, significantly increasing the launch cadence of strike aircraft compared to steam catapults. This surge in sortie generation rate is the critical metric in modern naval warfare, designed to overwhelm enemy air defenses through a sheer volume of simultaneous inbound threats. Defensive shielding is provided by Ticonderoga-class cruisers and Arleigh Burke-class destroyers equipped with the Aegis combat system, creating an impenetrable anti-missile umbrella over the fleet. These surface combatants are seamlessly integrated with submarine assets carrying Tomahawk land attack missiles, offering a covert first strike capability against hardened Iranian command bunkers. The strategic deployment of these assets to the Persian Gulf, Red Sea, and Eastern Mediterranean completes a 360-degree encirclement, forcing Iran to split its defensive radar focus. This multi-axis threat environment complicates the calculation for Iranian air defense commanders, who must now anticipate saturation attacks from every cardinal direction simultaneously. The United States creates a dilemma of presence, where the mere positioning of these assets serves as a kinetic negotiation tactic, redefining the parameters of diplomacy. This methodology is defined as bargaining under fire, a coercive strategy where diplomatic engagement occurs exclusively within the shadow of imminent military escalation. The operational logic dictates that negotiations are not an alternative to war, but a parallel track where military pressure is dialed up to force capitulation. President Trump's warning of a traumatic alternative to a deal suggests a shift from limited punitive strikes to a comprehensive dismantling of regime stability. The target set has expanded beyond nuclear centrifuges to include the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' economic and political control mechanisms, threatening the regime's very existence. By threatening the center of gravity, the regime's hold on power, Washington aims to bypass the nuclear stalemate and force a survival-based decision from the Ayatollah. Iranian intelligence is acutely aware of this shift, observing the deployment of F-15E Strike Eagles and A-10 Thunderbolt IIs to forward operating bases in the region. The presence of the A-10, a close air support platform, signals a readiness to engage ground targets in a permissive environment, implying the prior destruction of Iranian air defenses. Internally, the Iranian regime faces a pressure cooker scenario, with the 40-day mourning cycle for protesters potentially catalyzing renewed nationwide civil unrest. The intersection of religious observance and political grievance creates a predictable flashpoint, which the regime is attempting to preempt through draconian digital surveillance measures. Reports confirm the utilization of advanced facial recognition algorithms to identify dissenters, followed by preventative detentions and coerced televised confessions to fabricate foreign conspiracies. The parroting of Baha'i minority members on state television serves a dual purpose: scapegoating a vulnerable internal enemy and signaling absolute ruthlessness to the broader population. However, the regime's reliance on terror indicates a fragility in its social contract, a vulnerability that Western intelligence agencies are likely exploiting to foment internal division. In the diplomatic arena, the Swiss-hosted talks in Geneva represent the final off-ramp, mediated by Oman, a traditional back-channel facilitator between Washington and Tehran. The Iranian foreign minister's dismissal of these talks as a circus is a tactical bluff, designed to project strength to domestic audiences while soliciting concessions abroad. The core Iranian demand remains the lifting of economic sanctions to alleviate the liquidity crisis, a concession the U.S. is unwilling to grant without irreversible nuclear rollback. Israel's position is absolute. Any agreement that fails to address ballistic missile stockpiles and regional proxy funding is fundamentally flawed and operationally unacceptable. Prime Minister Netanyahu has communicated that Israel retains the sovereign right to independent military action if the diplomatic track fails to neutralize the existential threat. This divergence in risk tolerance between Washington and Jerusalem adds a layer of complexity, with Israel preparing for a unilateral strike on missile production facilities. The munitions economics of such a conflict are stark. Israel's interceptor stockpiles for Iron Dome and David's Sling are finite and expensive to replenish. A saturation attack by Iran involving hundreds of ballistic missiles would aim to deplete these magazines, exposing Israeli population centers to subsequent waves of fire. Consequently, the Israeli defensive doctrine emphasizes a preemptive counterforce strike to destroy launchers on the ground before they can initiate a firing sequence. This necessitates real-time intelligence and rapid kill chain execution, capabilities that the IDF has been honing through simulated drills and recent operations in Syria. In the northern theater, the degradation of Hezbollah's capabilities continues, with the Israeli Air Force systematically targeting logistics hubs south of the Litani River. The Radwan Force, Hezbollah's elite offensive unit, has been forced into a defensive posture, retreating from the border to protect rear-echelon supply lines. Operational analysis indicates the Radwan units have shifted focus from cross-border invasion planning to survival and the preservation of long-range rocket assets. North of the Litani, the Badr unit, mistakenly referred to as Badger in some reports, is tasked with maintaining the organization's strategic depth and command continuity. This restructuring reflects the success of the IDF's mowing the grass strategy, which has eroded Hezbollah's tactical confidence and disrupted their command and control hierarchy. The discovery of 1,300 Grad rockets in the village of Kafra exposes the depth of Hezbollah's entrenchment within civilian infrastructure, complicating target selection. Israel's counter-strategy involves precision raids, such as the extraction of senior operatives like Atawi, to gather human intelligence on the remaining stockpile locations. These snatch-and-grab operations provide critical data points on the location of hardened bunkers and fiber-optic communication networks used by Hezbollah leadership. The integration of air power with special forces operations allows Israel to maintain a high tempo of attrition without committing to a full-scale ground invasion. However, the threat of a multi-front war remains the primary strategic concern, with Iranian proxies in Syria and Iraq positioned to open secondary fronts. The IDF has preemptively struck weapons caches in southern Syria, destroying mines and communication equipment destined for cross-border infiltration teams. By interdicting these supply lines, Israel is effectively severing the land bridge that connects Tehran to Beirut, isolating Hezbollah from its patron. The Lebanese National Army remains a passive actor, lacking the political will and military capacity to enforce United Nations Resolution 1701 south of the Litani. This power vacuum forces Israel to act as the de facto enforcer of the demilitarized zone, conducting strikes that the international community tacitly accepts as necessary. The economic dimension of this proxy war is highlighted by the disparity in pay. Hezbollah operatives earn double the salary of Lebanese soldiers, ensuring loyalty through financial dependence. Iranian funding, routed through Turkish financial networks, remains the lifeblood of Hezbollah, enabling it to sustain operations despite the collapse of the Lebanese economy. As the USS Gerald R enters the operational theater, the potential for a coordinated U.S.-Israeli strike on these financial and logistical networks increases exponentially. The convergence of military timelines, diplomatic deadlines, and internal instability creates a perfect storm dynamic, pushing the region toward a decisive resolution. This demand constitutes a poison pill for the peace process, as it would effectively allow Hamas to rebrand its enforcers as legitimate state police. The United States and international mediators have categorically rejected this integration, viewing it as a clear violation of the fundamental disarmament mandate. On the ground, Hamas combatants are adapting by shedding uniforms and infiltrating protected civilian infrastructure, specifically the Nasser Hospital complex in Khan Yunis. Reports from Médecins Sans Frontières confirm the withdrawal of staff due to the verified presence of armed combatants operating within active medical wards. This weaponization of humanitarian sites forces the IDF into a tactical bind, necessitating surgical rules of engagement to neutralize threats without mass casualty events. The IDF's persistence in these clearance operations signals to Tehran that the Gaza front cannot be preserved as a strategic asset for the axis of resistance. Director General Al Zamir's recent tour of the Rafah sector underscored the irreversibility of the campaign, declaring the dismantling of Hamas's military battalions complete. However, the transition from battalion-level combat to counterinsurgency requires a sustained intelligence grid to prevent the regeneration of command nodes. Concurrently, in the northern arena, the conflict dynamics are governed by a policy of zero rehabilitation, strictly enforcing the degradation of Hezbollah's infrastructure. The Israeli Air Force has initiated a new strike cadence targeting logistical attempts to rebuild launch sites in the Wadi Baraza and Tufai sectors. Any movement of construction materials or dual-use equipment into these zones is designated as a hostile act, triggering immediate kinetic interdiction. This enforcement policy effectively creates a kill zone south of the Litani River, preventing Hezbollah from restoring its pre-war firing positions. Intelligence assessments indicate a significant restructuring of Hezbollah's force disposition, specifically regarding the elite Radwan unit. Originally trained for offensive cross-border incursions, the Radwan force has been degraded and repurposed for defensive holding actions north of the Litani. This defensive shift is further evidenced by the activation of the Badr unit, often misidentified as Badr, responsible for the sector north of the Litani River to Sidon. The Badr unit is now tasked with establishing a secondary defensive line, anticipating an IDF ground maneuver that pushes deeper into Lebanese territory. Hezbollah's strategy has devolved into a game of survival, relying on shoot-and-scoot tactics with their remaining inventory of short-range projectiles. The discovery of 1,300 Grad rockets in Kafra illustrates the density of the threat. These are unguided saturation weapons designed to overwhelm civilian areas. To sustain this attrition, Tehran continues to funnel liquidity to its Lebanese proxy, utilizing illicit financial networks running through Turkey. Financial intelligence tracks monthly stipends of approximately $500 paid to Hezbollah fighters, double the salary of the Lebanese National Army soldier. This economic disparity ensures recruitment continuity for Hezbollah despite the collapse of the Lebanese state economy and hyperinflation. The Turkish financial corridor remains a critical vulnerability, one that is likely being targeted by U.S. Treasury sanctions and covert cyber financial warfare. Meanwhile, the IDF continues to execute targeted assassinations of senior commanders in Beirut, demonstrating that no sanctuary exists within the Lebanese capital. These decapitation strikes in the Dahieh stronghold serve to disrupt strategic decision-making and sow paranoia within the organization's upper echelon. The psychological impact is compounded by the IDF's ability to extract high-value targets from deep within southern Lebanon for interrogation. The capture of the operative Atawi from the village of Al-Arouk provides human intelligence that electronic surveillance alone cannot yield. This fusion of human and SIGINT allows the IDF to map the shifting center of gravity of Hezbollah's command network as it attempts to reorganize. Regionally, the Syrian front acts as a logistical artery, with the IDF aggressively interdicting weapon shipments before they cross the border. Recent strikes in southern Syria have targeted storage facilities containing communication equipment and anti-tank mines intended for the Lebanese front. This interdiction campaign is designed to starve Hezbollah of the advanced munitions required to challenge Israeli air superiority or armor. The Lebanese National Army's inability to secure its own borders or dismantle bunkers, south of the Litani leaves a security vacuum that Israel is forced to fill. Consequently, the border region has become a de facto extension of the Israeli security zone, enforced by air power and artillery rather than permanent occupation. The strategic question remains whether Hezbollah will commit its strategic reserve of precision-guided missiles if Iran comes under direct American attack. Such a decision would trigger an all-out war scenario, involving the targeting of Israeli critical infrastructure such as power grids and desalination plants. Israel's civil defense preparations reflect this reality, with the home front command drilling scenarios for multi-front missile saturation. The integration of American THAAD batteries into the regional defense grid provides a crucial backstop against this high-altitude ballistic threat. As the diplomatic clock in Geneva ticks down, the readiness posture of all Iranian proxies is being elevated to maximum alert. The synchronization of the Gaza stabilization with the northern degradation campaign is critical to preventing a unified front against Israel. By isolating the theaters, the IDF aims to defeat the components of the axis of resistance sequentially rather than simultaneously. The coming weeks will test the resilience of this isolation strategy as the USS Gerald R. Ford brings the region to a strategic tipping point. The strategic fulcrum of this crisis rests on the nightmare scenario simulation, a coordinated high-volume ballistic missile saturation strike originating from Iranian soil. Intelligence estimates suggest Tehran's arsenal includes the Sejil and Karamshar medium-range ballistic missiles, capable of carrying high-yield warheads to any coordinate in Israel. The operational doctrine of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps emphasizes swarm tactics, firing simultaneous salvos to overwhelm the tracking radar of defensive batteries. In response, Israel has activated its multi-layered air defense architecture, integrating the Arrow 3 for exo-atmospheric interception and David's Sling for mid-course threats. However, the critical vulnerability is not technological but economic. The disparity in cost between an interceptor and an incoming projectile creates an unsustainable attrition curve. This munitions economics dictates that a prolonged exchange favors the aggressor with the cheaper, mass-produced inventory over the defender with finite, high-tech countermeasures. To offset this asymmetry, the United States has deployed Aegis-equipped destroyers to the eastern Mediterranean, extending the radar horizon and engagement envelope. These naval assets provide a shoot-look-shoot capability, allowing for multiple interception attempts against a single ballistic threat before it enters terminal descent. The integration of American and Israeli command and control systems creates a unified sky picture, reducing the decision cycle time for engagement authority. Diplomatic channels in Geneva are operating in direct correlation to this kinetic buildup, with Omani intermediaries shuttling proposals between Washington and Tehran. The American delegation, reportedly led by envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, is aggressively leveraging the military threat to extract concessions on ballistic missile development. This marks a fundamental doctrinal shift from previous negotiations, where the ballistic missile program was treated as a peripheral issue rather than a central pillar. Israel's insistence on including missile proliferation in the agreement stems from the strategic understanding that a nuclear-capable delivery system constitutes the ultimate threat. Prime Minister Netanyahu has explicitly warned President Trump that any diplomatic deal excluding missiles and proxy support will be considered null and void by Jerusalem. The sunset clauses of previous agreements, which allowed restrictions to expire over time, are now viewed as unacceptable vulnerabilities by the Israeli security establishment. Conversely, the Iranian regime views its indigenous missile program as a sovereign right and the only guarantee against external regime change operations. To break this deadlock, the U.S. Treasury Department is executing a financial strangulation strategy targeting the 80% of Iranian oil exports flowing to China. By threatening secondary sanctions against Chinese financial institutions processing these transactions, Washington aims to sever the regime's hard currency lifeline completely. This economic warfare is designed to precipitate a hyperinflationary spiral within Iran, eroding the purchasing power of the rial and fueling domestic unrest. The correlation between oil revenue and internal stability is direct. Without petrodollars, the regime cannot subsidize the patronage networks that ensure loyalty. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi's condemnation of European surrender reflects the regime's isolation as the Western economic bloc aligns with U.S. sanctions policy. The regime's counter-strategy involves a resistance economy, relying on illicit smuggling networks and localized barter trade to bypass the global banking system. However, these stopgap measures are insufficient to sustain a modern military-industrial complex or the funding requirements of regional proxies like Hezbollah. The bargaining under fire model assumes that the regime is rational and will prioritize its own survival over its nuclear ambitions when faced with total collapse. Yet, intelligence profiles of the supreme leader suggest an ideological rigidity that may perceive compromise as a fatal sign of weakness. This psychological factor introduces a high degree of unpredictability, increasing the probability of a miscalculation that triggers an inadvertent escalation. The presence of the USS Gerald R. Ford acts as a forcing function, compressing the decision-making timeline for Tehran's leadership to a matter of weeks. Military planners are preparing for a preemptive degradation option, where Allied forces strike launch sites immediately upon detecting fueling signatures. Liquid-fueled missiles, like the MAD, require hours of preparation, creating a detectable thermal and visual signature that satellites can track in real time. Solid-fueled variants, however, can be launched with minimal warning, reducing the window for preemption to minutes and stressing the defensive grid. The day-after scenario for Iran does not envision a ground occupation but a punitive containment, stripping the state of its offensive capabilities. This contrasts with the Gaza model, where physical control of territory is required to dismantle the subterranean infrastructure of Hamas. The divergence in strategy, air power for Iran, ground maneuver for Gaza, reflects the different operational requirements of state versus non-state actors. In the Syrian theater, the IDF continues to enforce red lines, striking any attempt to transfer advanced guidance kits to Hezbollah forces in Lebanon. These precision guidance kits are a strategic game-changer, converting dumb rockets into precision munitions capable of targeting specific buildings. Israel has designated the transfer of PGK technology as a casus belli, necessitating immediate kinetic interdiction regardless of the diplomatic fallout. The Russian presence in Syria complicates these operations, requiring a deconfliction mechanism to avoid engaging Russian air defense assets. Despite these geopolitical constraints, the Israeli Air Force maintains operational freedom, utilizing standoff munitions to strike targets while remaining in Israeli airspace. The intricate web of alliances and enmities in the region creates a fragile equilibrium, where a single tactical error could unravel the entire security architecture. As the countdown to the diplomatic deadline continues, the region is effectively held hostage by the physics of missile flight times and the speed of political decision-making. The U.S. administration remains publicly optimistic about a deal, a stance likely intended to maintain diplomatic legitimacy while preparing the military option. Privately, defense officials acknowledge that the window for a non-kinetic resolution is closing rapidly as Iran continues to enrich uranium. The International Atomic Energy Agency reports that Iran's stockpile of 60% enriched uranium has grown, bringing them dangerously close to weapons-grade purity. This breakout time, the period required to produce enough fissile material for one bomb, is now measured in days, not months. Consequently, the U.S. and Israel are operating under a prevention doctrine, committed to stopping the weaponization process by any means necessary. The convergence of the nuclear file, the ballistic missile threat, and regional proxy aggression creates a triad of instability. Addressing this triad requires a synchronized approach, leveraging all instruments of national power: diplomatic, economic, and military. The coming days will reveal whether the wall of fire strategy succeeds in deterring Iran or if it merely accelerates the slide toward conflict. For the residents of the region, the abstraction of geopolitical strategy translates into the tangible reality of preparing bomb shelters and emergency supplies. The narrative of the Middle East is being rewritten in real time with the ink of diplomacy and the steel of war. Within the Iranian domestic sphere, the Arabian mourning cycle for slain protesters has evolved into a predictable vector for civil unrest. To counter this, the Islamic Republic has deployed a digital authoritarianism model, utilizing Chinese-supplied facial recognition technology to map and preempt dissent networks. Intelligence reports confirm the integration of AI-driven surveillance across Tehran's metro system, allowing the IRGC to execute predictive arrests of identified agitators. The televised coerced confessions of Baha'i minority members serve as a psychological operation designed to frame genuine economic grievances as foreign orchestrated sabotage. This internal fragility forces the regime to adopt a siege mentality, viewing any concession at the Geneva talks as a catalyst for revolutionary momentum. Consequently, the Supreme Leader's directive to negotiators is to secure sanctions relief without surrendering the strategic depth provided by regional proxy militias. The diplomatic architecture in Geneva, facilitated by Swiss neutrality and Omani mediation, is structured to allow for deniable back-channel communication. Oman's role is critical as the diplomatic clearinghouse, filtering messages between Washington and Tehran to prevent misinterpretation during high-tension cycles. However, the bargaining under fire framework imposes a kinetic tax on these talks. Every delay in compliance results in an incremental increase in military posture. The U.S. administration has signaled that the economic strangulation phase will intensify, specifically targeting the shadow banking network facilitating oil trade. By designating specific Chinese logistical firms as sanctioned entities, the Treasury Department aims to create a risk premium that makes Iranian oil toxic to global markets. This financial warfare is synchronized with the deployment of the USS Gerald R. Ford, creating a maximum pressure pincer of economic isolation and military encirclement. Regional partners, including Saudi Arabia and Jordan, are quietly integrating into this U.S.-led defensive architecture, hosting advanced radar and interception batteries. The deployment of THAAD systems to the Jordanian desert provides a critical mid-course interception layer for missiles traversing the Arabian Peninsula toward Israel. This tacit alliance represents a historic realignment where shared antipathy toward Iranian hegemony supersedes traditional geopolitical fractures. For the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the neutralization of the Houthi missile threat from Yemen is a primary strategic dividend of this cooperation. The Houthi rebels, acting as Iran's southern anchor, possess the capability to disrupt Red Sea maritime traffic, threatening global energy supply chains. U.S. naval assets in the Red Sea are currently engaged in a freedom of navigation mission, intercepting Houthi drones and anti-ship ballistic missiles. The kinetic engagement in the Red Sea serves as a microcosm of the broader conflict, illustrating Iran's ability to project power through dispensable proxies. In response, the U.S. is considering redesignating the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization, a legal maneuver to criminalize their financial support networks. Back in the Levant, the day-after governance model for Gaza remains the linchpin for stabilizing the Palestinian front of this multi-theater conflict. The proposed technocratic administration faces a legitimacy crisis unless it can deliver tangible reconstruction aid, which is contingent on total demilitarization. The reconstruction for disarmament formula is the primary leverage point, utilizing international donor funds to incentivize compliance from local power brokers. However, Hamas's spoiler potential remains high, with sleeper cells capable of executing high-profile attacks to derail the stabilization process. The IDF's counter-strategy involves the mowing the grass doctrine, periodic, intelligence-driven raids to disrupt self-formation before it reaches operational maturity. This unending cycle of clearance operations requires a permanent, albeit low-profile, security presence along the Philadelphia corridor to prevent rearmament. The Egyptian government, fearing a spillover of instability into the Sinai, has tacitly coordinated with Israel to seal the subterranean smuggling routes. In the north, the focus shifts to the psychological dimension of warfare, with the IDF conducting sonic boom flights over Beirut to signal air superiority. These operations are designed to erode the civilian support base for Hezbollah. The economic collapse in Lebanon acts as a force multiplier for Israeli strategy, as a destitute population grows increasingly resentful of Hezbollah's parallel state. Israel is exploiting this sentiment through information warfare, highlighting the disparity between Hezbollah's Iranian funding and the poverty of the average citizen. The narrative war is fought on social media platforms, where bot networks from both sides attempt to shape the perception of victory and defeat. Within this information battle space, the breakout time for an Iranian nuclear weapon remains the ultimate red line narrative driver. The International Atomic Energy Agency's access to Iranian facilities has been curtailed, creating an intelligence blind spot regarding centrifuge cascades. To compensate, Western intelligence agencies rely on satellite imagery and cyber espionage to monitor thermal signatures and power consumption at key sites. Any anomaly in these signatures could trigger a preemptive strike protocol, bypassing the diplomatic track entirely to neutralize the existential threat. The Samson option, Israel's theoretical use of its own undeclared nuclear deterrent, remains the unspoken variable in all strategic calculations. While officially ambiguous, the existence of this capability serves as the ultimate guarantee against an Iranian existential strike. The current geopolitical standoff is a high-stakes game of nuclear poker, where bluffing is indistinguishable from genuine intent until the moment of launch. As the diplomatic deadline approaches, the probability of a limited exchange spiraling into a regional conflagration increases exponentially. Military planners on both sides are operating under launch-on-warning postures, reducing the time available for de-escalation hotlines to function. The fog of war in the digital age is not a lack of information, but an overload of conflicting data points that paralyzes decision-making. Navigating this fog requires a cold logic that prioritizes national survival over ideological purity or diplomatic niceties. The U.S. administration's pivot to Asia has been effectively paused as the Middle East once again demands the full attention of the American security apparatus. This diversion of resources is viewed with concern in the Indo-Pacific, where allies fear distracted America may embolden other revisionist powers. Thus, the resolution of the Iran crisis has global strategic implications, influencing the balance of power far beyond the Persian Gulf. The credibility of deterrence is the currency of superpower status. A failure to contain Iran would devalue American security guarantees worldwide. Conversely, a successful coercive diplomacy outcome could reestablish American hegemony in the region for the next generation. The stakes are absolute: the preservation of the non-proliferation regime or the dawn of a nuclearized, unstable Middle East. We stand at the precipice of history, watching the tectonic plates of geopolitics shift in real time. The domestic political calculus within the United States acts as a critical constraint, with the war powers resolution looming over any extended engagement. Congressional oversight committees are demanding granular briefings on the end state objectives, wary of mission creep reminiscent of previous decades. However, the executive branch maintains that the current buildup falls under the umbrella of defensive deterrence, bypassing the need for immediate legislative authorization. This legal ambiguity allows for rapid deployment but creates a fragile consensus that could fracture upon the first significant American casualty. Across the Atlantic, European powers are oscillating between appeasement and alignment, their economies vulnerable to any disruption in the Strait of Hormuz. A closure of the strait would trigger a global energy shock, spiking oil prices and potentially plunging the Eurozone into a recessionary spiral. Consequently, French and British naval assets are quietly integrating into the US-led maritime coalition to ensure freedom of navigation. This internationalization of the conflict serves a strategic purpose, distributing the risk and legitimizing any potential military enforcement action. For the Iranian proxies, specifically Hezbollah and the Houthis, the current standoff presents an existential dilemma of abandonment. The fear within these groups is that Tehran may trade their capabilities away at the negotiating table to secure regime survival at home. This suspicion erodes the cohesion of the axis of resistance, creating fractures that Western intelligence agencies are actively exploiting. Psychological operations are broadcasting messages to proxy commanders, highlighting the disparity between their expendability and the safety of IRGC elites in Tehran. As the USS Gerald R. Ford strike group assumes its final firing position, the kinetic window opens a period where atmospheric conditions favor air operations. Meteorology plays a decisive role. Clear skies over the Persian Gulf maximize the efficacy of laser-guided munitions and satellite reconnaissance. The U.S. Cyber Command is simultaneously executing prep fires, infiltrating Iranian critical infrastructure networks to blind their early warning radars. This zero-day capability allows for the non-kinetic neutralization of air defenses seconds before physical ordnance impacts targets. The fusion of cyber and kinetic warfare creates a shock and awe effect designed to paralyze the enemy's OODA-loop: observe, orient, decide, act. Israel's contribution to this phase is the suppression of enemy air defenses, utilizing F-35 Aegis fighters to hunt mobile surface-to-air missile batteries. The Aegis variant is specifically modified with Israeli electronic warfare suites, optimized for the unique frequency spectrum of Russian-made Iranian defenses. The operational synergy between American mass and Israeli precision creates a formidable offensive juggernaut that few nations could withstand. Post-conflict planning envisions a NATO of the Middle East, a formalized security pact integrating Israel with the Gulf Cooperation Council states. This alliance would permanently shift the regional balance of power, creating a unified air defense shield stretching from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. The normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel is the diplomatic prize awaiting the successful containment of the Iranian threat. Such a realignment would isolate the radical rejectionist front, relegating them to the periphery of a prosperous, interconnected economic zone. However, the path to this future runs through the narrow straits of the current crisis, where the margin for error is non-existent. The munitions economics of the coming weeks will determine the victor. He who runs out of missiles first loses the war. Logistics chains are currently strained to the breaking point, with C-17 Globemaster transports flying round-the-clock sorties to resupply forward bases. The industrial base of the West is being stress-tested, revealing vulnerabilities in the production rate of precision-guided munitions. This supply chain fragility is a known variable, prompting the Pentagon to stockpile war reserve modes of essential ordnance in theater. As the clock ticks down on the diplomatic ultimatum, the region holds its collective breath, anticipating the flash of the first Tomahawk launch. The bargaining under fire strategy has reached its apex. Words are now backed by the imminent threat of devastating force. Whether this compels a rational retreat by Tehran or triggers a suicidal last stand remains the defining question of our time. The history of warfare teaches that deterrence only works if the threat is credible and the adversary believes you have the will to use it. The deployment of two carrier strike groups is the ultimate expression of that will, a floating sovereignty capable of erasing nations. We are witnessing the mechanics of empire in motion, the raw application of hard power to shape the geopolitical landscape. The outcome will not be decided by speeches or UN resolutions, but by the cold calculus of range, payload, and resolve. For the soldiers, sailors, and airmen on the line, the abstraction of policy has become the concrete reality of pre-combat checks. Their readiness is the guarantor of peace, or the instrument of victory should deterrence fail. As night falls over the Persian Gulf, the silent vigil of the radar operators continues, watching for the blip that starts the war. The wall of fire is built, the pieces are set, and the world waits for the next move. This is not merely a regional dispute. It is a stress test for the entire global security order established after the Cold War. A failure here would signal the end of the Pax Americana and the beginning of a chaotic, multipolar era defined by raw force. Conversely, success would reaffirm the rules-based international order, proving that aggression still carries an unbearable price. The diplomatic deadline is the event horizon. Once crossed, the gravitational pull of conflict may become inescapable. Every diplomatic cable, every intelligence briefing, every fleet maneuver is now converging on a singular point in time. The Middle East stands at the crossroads of history, with one path leading to integration and the other to conflagration. We will continue to monitor the situation with unwavering focus, analyzing the vectors of power as they align. Stay vigilant, stay informed, and understand that in the game of nations, there are no spectators, only participants. This concludes our strategic assessment of the current crisis. The next update will depend on the decisions made in the coming hours. History is being written now.